know we were just talking about
All right, good morning, everyone. If I can ask you please to take your seats, put your phones on silent, and enjoy the show. Welcome to the Housing, Land Use, Environment, and Transportation Committee. I think, Don, we'll start with you. If you'll please introduce yourself, and Peggy, if you can take that as roll. Thank you.
Don Rocha, Director of Parks and Recreation.
Joe Zintek, Director, Consumer and Environmental Protection Agency.
Tony Arata, Deputy Director, Roads and Airports Department.
Jacqueline Anshano, Director of Planning and Development.
Mike Wasserman, D1 Supervisor.
Joe Simidian, County Supervisor, 5th District. Good morning.
Gary Hersig, Deputy County Executive.
Steve Mitra, Assistant County Counsel.
Thank you. All right, we now move on to public comment, which is the opportunity for anyone to speak about anything not on today's agenda. We ask that you fill out a speaker card. Cards are right there. You pop in the plastic holder there. Peggy will pick them up. And Doug and Scott Largent, come on up. We only have 2 speakers under public comment, agenda item number 2, so you're each entitled to up to 3 minutes.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning, supervisors and staff. For the record, my name is Doug Muirhead. I live in Morgan Hill. My general interest today, other than the agenda, is how the county's doing on support for sustainable agriculture. I haven't heard much since last year and some talk about farm worker housing. My specific question for you is, will the county be putting on the ballot in November any thing that would allow funding for agricultural lands? And my additional ask is for agricultural water. I ask this because last year, the agricultural program manager responding to my complaint that we weren't out winning hearts and minds of our North County brethren, said I would be very impressed with what the county was going to put on the ballot in November. 2 agencies in the last 2 weeks have told me the county will not be putting anything on the ballot. And I would really just like to have that clarified. It's a tough time for our farm community, and unfortunately the Water District has always chosen at this time to, for their own perfectly good reasons, to get out of the business of being the sole funder for agricultural water subsidies. So, but I would like to know what's going to happen with the ballot measure, because that's kind of important if we're going to move forward, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Scott, come on forward, and Rhoda Fry, if you'll line up behind Scott.
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, everyone. Scott Largent. On my way down here this morning, I ran into a gal that was waiting for the 61 bus, and I kind of showed her how to use dial the 511 and figure out when the bus was coming. We had an interesting conversation. The best part about she's actually being housed tomorrow. She was homeless for 4.5 years. She didn't have it was just, she's at that final stretch. You know, she had lost the phone. They've had her in a couple hotel things. She's gotten her belongings back. I mean, this woman has fought. For a conversation from where the 61 stop is at to the Hall of Justice, it was really neat. It's like I've gained a new friend. And when I run into people that are on the streets, I ask them a lot, do they know about how they can get a waiver, for instance, for a new driver's license? How they can get the 3-month Lyft bus pass, when they need the low-income pass. Do they know different places where they can go get a sandwich? Do they know where they can get their mail delivered, at the window behind City Hall? These might seem like little small things, but these have been lifesavers to myself. I've been in and out of homelessness. If I didn't have that window over there to get my mail right now, I wouldn't get mail. And half the time I wouldn't eat. And they provide sandwiches, they provide lunch, and I'm not ashamed, it's been tough. But knowing about those resources is what's important. This woman now, she's at this final stretch right now, and she's now at the Hall of Justice fighting trespassing charges for encampments that she was living in. She was just trying to survive. So she's in court right now, and what I was kind of really wondering, I watched last night the State of the State address, which was pretty much about homelessness. It was all about homelessness. It was like, we need to start taking care of things, like big time. We need to stop criminally prosecuting these people. Okay, they were just trying to survive. We know how bad it's been. I would ask for both of you to push up on Rosen over there, DA Jeff Rosen. Justice needs to have compassion for these people right now. This woman right now has put her life back together and fighting these simple little charges. She should not be over there right now. She should be packing up the remaining amount of her belongings right now at the Motel 6 she's staying at, and she should be able to go over to her new place tomorrow. But she's so worried about getting to court. And her phone, she didn't have her phone. It's just sad. She's so close right now. So after this, I'm going to go over and sit down with her side by side in court and hopefully go up to that, the bench right there or to the stand and ask them, please don't prosecute this woman. She can't pay the fees and fines and stuff. You guys will end up paying them for her. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhoda. Come on forward. And I don't have any other cards from anyone else, so this will be our final speaker under public comment.
Good morning. Today is 2/20/2020. I'm here to ask for a progress report from a 2003 letter written by a Hewlett policy analyst pertaining to the protected ridgeline next to Rancho San Antonio. Also, what are you doing today to protect our 1972 ridgeline protection easement to prevent future potential devastation? Separately, we are requesting a full investigation as to why, prior to Director Anciano's arrival here, the county failed to prevent the permanent devastation of an illegal 40-foot wide road. This was counter to Public Resources Code 2207 that the county should not have allowed themselves to be turned away 3 times over a multi-month period. Also, I have multiple copies here that you can see a transcript of Lehigh's chairman, who's from Heidelberg Cement, Germany, that displays his disdain of the neighbors to whom he refers as Silicon Valley freaks, and even his own management team. Notable quotes are that we had always problems to run the plant. We fired the plant manager, the production manager, and maintenance repair manager. This happened in 2017. Now, I consider, a key performance indicator as labor safety fines proposed by the federal government. And in the years from 24 to 2016, safety fines were around $140,000. They escalated to 1.4 mil between 2017 and 2018. That's a nearly 10-fold increase since he replaced the management there. And also, there was the 2018 illegal road that was constructed, and along with the 2019 unstable mining of mountain of mining waste marching toward Permanente Creek, resulting in notices of violation from the county and the water board. Sorry, I sprinted here, and now I have this. We'll blame Lehigh for that. Number 2 sulfur polluter in the state of California, responsible for 12.7% of the state's sulfur pollution. Anyway, please also see the attached flyer that describes public health issues that the county has allowed to happen. The county's land use policies, or lack thereof, have created this mess. Not the water boards, not the air boards. It's you. Please help. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the public comment portion of our calendar. We move on to item 3, which is approval of the consent calendar. Supervised Committee, and I was thinking of putting 5 and 8 on consent, but I understand you've got a few comments and questions on 5. So I'd recommend we add 8 to the already existing list of 9 through 15.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am prepared to move the consent calendar with the addition of item number 8. However, I would like to keep item number 5 on the regular agenda, as you've indicated. Thank you for that. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to ask that item number 6, which deals with the TDM issue, Transportation Demand Management, be continued to our next meeting. And what I would suggest, if it's amenable to the chair, is that if there are folks who are here who wish to speak to that item,
We have one.
that we allow them to speak so the trip was not in vain, and then any comment that might be offered could help inform the discussion at our next meeting if possible.
That's fine, if it's okay with you as well. Let's just jump to item 6, which you asked to be continued. And we do have a speaker card. And if there's anybody else here that wishes to make any comments regarding item 6, which is now being continued, please come forward and fill out a speaker card. Mila Zelka, did I come close? Yeah? All right. I'm part Italian, so you know. Thank you. And you'll have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to speak. I am on the board of a nonprofit called Manzanita Works, and our mission is to support workers and worker family welfare. We are about to launch the first sub-regional transit co-op whose footprint is going to be from Sunnyvale to Redwood City, 8 cities total, 4 on either side of the county line. And this transit co-op is employer-led, it's public-private, and it's oriented to solve local problems, in particular gaps in connectivity between public transportation and places of employment. And we are partnering with local public transportation agencies. I mentioned that it's employer-led, not business-led, to specifically highlight that lots of different kinds of employers are struggling with transportation challenges for their staff to get to work and to recruit and retain related to the length of commuting, and the county is no exception. And so I wanted to invite the county to learn more about this co-op that's emerging. And to that, I sent in a letter as well as provided the guiding principles that we framed our program on. I also have 2 little teaser flyers. This is something we've been handing out to employers in 12 different cities, generally in the region. And this is a little flyer about our organization overall, so I'll just leave that there for the clerk. But essentially, we don't seek to duplicate services. So as you consider programs for TDM programs for your county staff, this is an opportunity to have economies of scale with other employers, including private employers who have significant transit systems. Thank you.
Mila. Appreciate that. Anybody else here that wishes to speak on item number 6? Seeing none, Peggy will consider item number 6 unanimously approved to be continued. We'll now move back regular numerical order to item number 4. Item number 4 is being presented by Dana. Come on forward, Mr. Reed. If the subject PG&E PSPS Preparedness Legislative Opportunities, Claims, and Community Resources. And again, anybody wishing to speak on these items, we ask you fill out a yellow speaker card in order to be recognized and have your time.
All right, good morning, Chair Wasserman, Vice Chair Smithian, and the members of Hewlett. Thank you for having us here today. I'll let, before I start, I'll have PG&E introduce themselves as well to Hewlett.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Quinlan. I am the Senior Director of Emergency Preparedness and Response for PG&E.
And I'm Jake Ziegelman. I'm a Director in PG&E's Customer Service Department.
All right, thank you for being here today as well. So as the Hewlett may be aware, we had a referral on January 14th from the full Board of Supervisors to receive a report at Hewlett relating to legislative opportunities, including grants, claims, information from PG&E, as well as a discussion on vulnerable communities and available community resources. You have before you that report back as a result of that referral to Hewlett. I'd like to point out that both the CEO's office, the County Council, and the full board have continued to be heavily engaged in the impacts of PSPS to the communities we serve. The Office of Emergency Management specifically recently has undertaken, which is also in the ledge file today, the need for us to increase our capacities with the community resource centers and to more strategically locate those as adjacencies to the impact zones, so that we've been in ongoing discussions with PG&E, and they have engaged us on that level. Of course, mitigation and preparedness continues to be the Office of Emergency Management's primary mission, so we continue to look for opportunities for notifications, public outreach, communications, and of course, increasing community resilience is always our priority, and maintaining our operational readiness in our Emergency Operations Center. I'm here to answer any questions that Hewlett may have of me, and I believe PG&E is here as well to do a presentation to Hewlett. Thank you.
Supervisor, any questions first?
I'm going to defer to you, Mr. Chairman. I will have comments and questions after the presentation.
Thank you. I the same. And final call out, anybody wishing to speak, submit a card. Thank you. Please go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for having us here today. Again, Jake Zigelman, Director of Customer Service at PG&E. My responsibilities include oversight of all of our local field-based customer service teams for roughly half of our PG&E service territory. Before diving into the slides and the prepared presentation, I do want to say thank you for the engagement, the partnership, and the ongoing feedback. As Mr. Reed mentioned, we are in ongoing conversations related to CRCs and critical facilities and several other topics, so we appreciate that partnership and that ongoing interaction and all of your feedback. Let me start by saying we've learned a lot of difficult lessons over the last fire season, and we're committing to improving on a number of fronts. Everything we're doing through the full community wildfire safety program is with the primary purpose of improving public safety and reducing the risk of catastrophic wildfire. That said, we do recognize and realize that PSPS is the hot topic, and that in particular presents a number of challenges, hardships, and just general disruption to our customers and our communities. And we do owe it to our customers and communities to get much better at how we implement those events. So we'll cover some of those various community wildfire safety program elements, including PSPS. I do want to highlight that, again, that we'd like this to be an ongoing dialogue. And we do have plans to come back and share even more specifics related to the work in Santa Clara County as our 2020 wildfire mitigation plan gets sorted out in terms of the detailed portfolio of work that is happening across our system, and that is happening now. So we'll likely be back again in the spring to talk with County OEM. We've been engaged in listening sessions with all of our impacted counties in what we're calling our first round of listening tour sessions, and we'll be back again in the spring to talk much more details. So with that, I will dive into the deck here. Okay. So this may be a repeat for some of you, but I think it's important to ground everyone in the three main pillars of our community wildfire safety program. And those three are real-time monitoring and intelligence, new and enhanced safety measures, and our system hardening and resiliency. And so within those, what real-time monitoring and intelligence is comprised primarily of our Wildfire Safety Operations Center, which is a relatively new function that we've stood up. It's actually in Mark's organization. Come wildfire season, well, let me back up. It's operating year-round, but come wildfire season, it is a 24/7 operation where we are monitoring wildfire risk across our system. Fire starts. It gives us the opportunity to get out and take some preventative action related to our assets, position our resources appropriately related to fire and fire risk in our service territory. So that is a real-time monitoring operation that is going 24/7 during wildfire season. The second and the third elements there are related to expanding the network of PG&E weather stations and high-definition cameras. Again, those two are really about data collection and having more real-time intelligence that inform our operations. The second pillar, new and enhanced safety measures. This relates to a lot of our ongoing operational work, enhanced veg management, accelerated and enhanced safety inspections of all of our electric infrastructure, which is especially targeted in our elevated and extreme high fire threat districts. Disabling automatic reclosing of circuit breakers and reclosers. So this is essentially taking out of service operational devices that are meant to increase reliability, but in fire season present a potential risk because they automatically close in and test those electrical lines and have the potential to create an ignition there. And so we disable all of those during fire season as well. And then the last element there, of course, is our public safety power shutoff, which we'll talk about a bit more. Third pillar there, system hardening and resiliency. This is really, it's certainly ongoing work, but it's longer term as well. This is where we're hardening our system with covered wire, stronger poles. We're doing some targeted undergrounding, replacing infrastructure, and then as well looking at ways that our local communities can become more resilient through the use of microgrids and targeted generation solutions. So those are the three primary pillars of our community wildfire safety program. Excuse me. Here you can see the California Public Utilities Commission High Fire Threat District. This is specific to Santa Clara County. The red there is what's considered Tier 3 or extreme high fire threat risk. The gold or yellow color is a Tier 2 elevated risk. And then anything that doesn't have a color is considered Tier 1, kind of normal fire risk. This map was developed in coordination with CAL FIRE. It is owned by the CPUC, but was developed with input from CAL FIRE, as well as input from utilities and communications infrastructure, because it's based on a number of factors, including the terrain and the topography and the vegetation, but also takes into account the location of utility assets and the interplay of those assets with the area. We do prioritize work in our locations of highest risk of wildfire. That's again based on factors like potential ignition risk associated with equipment, risk of wildfire spreading if one were to occur, and ingress and egress issues or challenges with those communities.
Jake, if I may, the stars there, San Jose, Los Gatos, and Gilroy, is that the downtown? What do the stars represent?
Yeah, that's what they're meant to be. They're really just meant to be reference points because we recognize there's not a ton of detail on this particular screenshot.
Gotcha. I just couldn't. I saw the yellow and pink in the legend. I didn't see the stars. So the stars are simply the downtown.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you.
And you can access these maps on the CPUC website in much greater detail. You can zoom in and see it in a much better resolution. I do think it's important to point out that while customers in the high fire threat Tier 2, Tier 3 areas are more likely to be affected and impacted by a PSPS event, we'd like to make it very clear that all of our more than 5 million customers could have their power shut off in one of these PSPS events because of the interconnected nature of the grid and those power lines working together to provide electricity across cities, counties, and regions. So we certainly have seen in our experience that the bulk of the impacts are in those red and yellow areas, not just here, but across our entire service territory. But it is important for all customers to be prepared because they could be impacted by a PSPS event. Move us along here. So as we all know, last year it did become necessary for PG&E to temporarily turn off electricity to certain neighborhoods or communities for safety due to gusty winds and dry conditions, combined with a heightened fire risk that were forecasted. We did, in last October, experience the strongest windstorms in over a decade, with some areas of our system exceeding winds of 60 to 100 miles per hour. So you can see here the the details of the two events that were experienced here in Santa Clara County. Roughly 35,000 in the first event, 25,000 in the second. Mr. Reed touched on community resource centers. In the first event, we had one that was established. In the second, we had two. You can see the number of visitors there on the screen. As he mentioned, we are doing a lot of work right now to develop our 2020 PSPS CRC program, and are in communication with county OEM as well as all of our counties to build that out, so we have pre-established hardened sites ready to go for this year's fire season. You can see there the peak wind gusts in each event. We'll talk a little bit more about what we were forecasting versus what we actually saw. And then the damage and the hazard incidents, again, I'll show some pictures of those. What we really mean there is damage is anything that caused actual damage to our assets, like a limb or a tree falling into a conductor and causing a downed wire. It could be damaging a transformer, something like that. A hazard is more about, vegetation being draped over our lines or in our lines, and something that could have caused an ignition. And then you can see the maximum outage durations for those events. Okay. So this is what we were forecasting in terms of wind speed prior to the October 9th through 12th event. This is based on one of our internal proprietary weather models, but it takes input from a number of other weather models. And you can see there that in the blue bullseye towards the upper center, we were forecasting winds of 60 plus miles per hour. And I do want to point out that it wasn't just PG&E forecasting that. There was general consensus from multiple weather services that we were anticipating to see those wind speeds. And again, I'll remind folks that our general criteria for, well, one of the criteria that we evaluate as we think about executing a PSPS event is wind speed, with winds generally above 25 miles per hour or above 45 miles per hour for gusts. This slide shows what we actually experienced with a high wind speed of 36 miles per hour in that same general vicinity. As we all know, with weather forecasting, that weather forecast doesn't always materialize in terms of the intensity or the location or the timing that we necessarily forecast up front, and we did see some differences there. But we do, something to point out there as well is we need to plan for these events well in advance, and we're activating our emergency procedures up to 72 hours in advance and establishing a readiness posture even in advance of that. And so we're looking at these forecasts several days out and making decisions as to calling that PSPS event as we get closer to that weather window. But due to the operational nature of de-energizing parts of our system, we do need that time. And so that's why sometimes you do see a PSPS event being initiated based on the weather forecast, and that forecast doesn't always materialize exactly as we anticipated. And I can talk a little bit more about that as well in a moment.
Jake, I'm just going to throw in one question here, and I've got far more questions than it would be fair to burden all these people here listening. And I appreciate your offer to come back at another meeting, and perhaps I'll get through a few this time. I'll have more for you next time. But when I see maps like this and I hear about the hardening that you're doing now, can you say on behalf of PG&E that all replacements of poles now, all replacements of wires, condensers, all those things that you're doing now, ongoing maintenance or as a result of inspections, Are all of those things that you're installing now designed to meet these types of concerns? And the reason I ask that, I'm in the process of designing a new home. I have to abide what the current seismic regulations are. So when I build, it has to presume an earthquake of 7.5 or something, whatever the number is now. When you install new equipment or replace existing equipment or find faulty equipment that needs to be serviced or replaced, are you doing so with the hardened equipment in these areas that you've identified and that already have a history of 25-mile-an-hour winds or more and 45-mile-an-hour gusts or more? Is that what PG&E is doing daily? Can you say yes or no to
Yeah,
that?
thank you for the question, Supervisor Wasserman. I'll take a stab and maybe Mark can help me out. We have established new and more stringent standards, especially targeting these high fire threat districts. And so the short answer is yes. As we replace these assets, they're all designed and constructed to the new standards, and our system hardening projects are being installed to the new standards.
Great. That's what I was looking for. That's exactly. I'm just cutting you off because I could go on forever on this particular. It happens to be a real sore spot for me. We each have our pet peeves, whatever you want to call them, but I'm not going to do that here today. But it was that kind of an answer that I was looking for. Mark, did you have something to add? Otherwise, that answer was sufficient for me.
I support Jake's comments. 100% of our transmission and distribution is kind of in scope for PSPS, but the equipment itself, depending on the construction type, between a transmission line and distribution circuit, there's different thresholds that pull those assets in play. And it takes a lot faster wind gusts and to that extent to pull in some of our our high voltage equipment. But to your question, it is certainly our intent to be going in here and putting hardened equipment in there that could sustain these types of wind speeds. But it's not a 100% absolute that it would be out of scope, because a lot of this is dependent on weather, and if we were forecasting winds that exceeded that, then it would be back in play.
Excuse
but
me,
it's
through the
consistent
chair.
with your intent.
Yes, Supervisor.
What does the phrase out of scope mean?
Out of scope means not included in PSPS when we're in the process of identifying what assets are going to be shut off, and that's primarily based on geography.
Does that mean then that you're not really going to replace 100% of the equipment with hardened facilities because it's, quote, out of scope?
So we have.
Forgive me, I believe that was a yes or no question, and I believe it hasn't yet been answered.
Yes, I will give it a shot. We have a plan in place to harden 7,100 miles of our assets that traverse Tier 2 and Tier 3 areas. That is a long-term plan that is currently anticipated to take 12 to 13 years. So back to your question, Supervisor Wasserman, we do have the new standards in place. We are hardening to those standards. As we replace assets, they are being built to those standards. But in terms of getting through the 7,100 miles, that is going to take some time to get all of those assets up to those new standards.
Excuse me, through the chair again,
Yes.
if I may. And thank you for your forbearance, Supervisor. I appreciate it. So, I understand there's a sort of a half-empty, half-full way of looking at these things. But just to be clear, in order to get the assets hardened so that they're sufficient to the challenge, we're looking at more than a decade, yes?
Our current, yes.
And what is it that's out of scope even during that decade?
Primarily all the assets in Tier 1 areas.
Okay. So in high-risk areas, Tier 2 and Tier 3, we're looking at more than a decade. And in areas which are still subject to some risk, but lesser risk, we may not see any hardening there at all over the course of that decade. Is that a fair summary of what you're sharing with us?
That's fair. I would add that system hardening is just one of the many tools in this community wildfire safety program toolkit. It's one of the more important long-term ones that will ultimately mitigate the need for PSPS events. But all of the enhanced vegetation that we're doing, the installation of sectionalizing devices, there's quite a bit of work that is being done to mitigate the risk of catastrophic wildfire.
And the timeline on that would be what? That other work?
A lot of that is just ongoing. So, for example, our accelerated or rather enhanced inspection work. Last year, we inspected all 750,000 of our assets in the Tier 2 and Tier 3 areas from top to bottom. Our intent is to continue that on an annual cycle for assets in Tier 3 areas and on a 3-year cycle for Tier 2 areas. So that is a change. And those inspections inform the real-time condition of our assets in the field, which then directly inform decisions like PSPS and the state of our assets and their ability to withstand wind speeds, things like that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me insert myself in your questioning. I don't want to take you or the presenters further off track. I will have some questions and comments after we've made our way through the rest of the presentation. Thank you again.
And Jake, I'll have just one more comment to make now, and then we'll get into whatever. But I manage commercial property, and every few years the ADA requirements change. The slope of a ramp for a person in a chair to get up. I know when we do new construction, we have to build them to current codes. But there are some codes, such as ADA, that commercial property owners have to upgrade their properties whether or not they're doing anything. And they're given a couple of years to do so, whether or not they're doing new construction. To me, we know of a safety hazard that exists here. I don't understand the 10-year plan. I know at the county, and Jacqueline, correct me if I was wrong, if we were made aware of an unsafe living hazard, health and safety hazard, we would not tell the resident, you have 10 years to correct this life-threatening issue that we red tagged you for. Sometimes we go onto properties looking for something and we see something else over here and we red tag it because we're aware of it. They cannot use it anymore when it's red tagged. They must make the repairs in a timely manner or fine start. But that's what we do to the residents. So when I hear you say you've got a 10-year plan, it's a little disheartening. When I'm on my house on Broadway in downtown Los Gatos, on the map you have up there, where Highway 9 and 17 intersect at the S of Los, and I see contracted, I think you pronounce it Esplund, the tree company, Esplunda, I don't. Esplund.
Yep.
When I see them out there clearing the branches around the transmission wires, making our trees look like this, and they say they're subcontracted out by PG&E to do that. And then I see that area on your page 5 or one of your pages subsequent. Yes, thank you, there. The area there, PG&E is subcontracting tree contractors to clear the branches from the wires, is in the white area on this map. I would much prefer PG&E hire Esplund or whomever to clear branches away from wires in the yellow and orange areas where the threat, Tier 2, Tier 3, thank you very much, as compared to that blue star. So I don't, and Daniel's here too, and I appreciate that. And Jake and Mark, I appreciate the two of you being here. But as a supervisor, as a resident, I don't get the double standard in having 10 years to correct a life-threatening, potentially life-threatening situation, number one. And number two, spending resources to have branches cleared from trees in an area that's not tier 2 or tier 3. I think if you'd send those guys from Broadway out to Black Road, we might prevent a fire.
Thank you, Supervisor Wasserman.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Through the chair, I do want to follow up one more time, but I want to let the gentleman answer his question.
Appreciate your feedback. A number of comments with respect to what you said. In terms of the decade or decade plus system hardening plan, I think Mark and I would both agree with you that we would prefer for it to be much shorter, and we will be doing everything we can to shorten that time frame. Secondly, if we come across an asset through our inspections or through our routine maintenance work that does not meet the standards and is in an unsafe condition, we will de-energize that line and take it out of service, particularly on the transmission side, and switch around it and keep people in power. For example, the Caribou-Palermo line in Butte County was de-energized, has been de-energized for quite some time. But if we find an unsafe condition on any of our assets, we will take that out of service immediately. With respect to the tree trimming and the vegetation work, we do plan to trim or prune or remove over 1 million trees, specifically in the tier 2 and tier 3 areas. So you'll see those folks everywhere. And part of the reason you see them in potentially the white area, the downtown Los Gatos area, is that we do have a number of circuits that are coming out of the Los Gatos substation that then go southwest and branch out. And so much of that vegetation, if that got into the lines in a tier 1 or lower risk area, that still has the potential to impact all of the customers downstream of that. So we'll be trimming and pruning trees everywhere, with specific plans to remove over 1 million just in the tier 2 and tier 3 areas.
Appreciate that. I just suggest you start in the tier 3 first. Supervisor.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to was it 7,100 miles of hardening? Was that the number I heard?
That's correct.
Here's the math that I'm struggling with. I have the Community Wildfire Safety Program, Wildfire Safety Plan update that you all have issued, and it talks about key wildfire safety initiatives for 2019. And it indicates that there was 150 miles planned, but that 171 miles were actually subject to hardening. And so I think the communication then indicates that the goal was not only met but exceeded because you were at 114% hardened. Am I understanding this communication properly?
I think I don't have it in front of me, but I think what you're likely referring to is percent met on the 2019 mileage target specifically. But
Yeah.
To your broader question, I think what you're getting at is the math on a straight line basis doesn't quite pencil out.
Yeah, if I divide 7,100 miles by the 171 miles that you got done in 19, at that rate, we'd be looking at more than 40 years, which is the source of concerns. So
Right.
You've anticipated my question, which I appreciate. I'm now looking forward to understanding whether or not that's a source of concern as well.
So our current plan is that 12 to 14-year window. We'd like to make that even faster and accelerate that. This is resource-intensive work. It requires a substantial amount of upfront planning, permitting, but to be perfectly candid, we are going to have to get faster, more efficient, more effective at this work, and we've been really embarking on this system hardening journey starting last year as our first year at it. This year we're going to harden more mileage, but we're going to have to get faster and get more mileage completed on a yearly basis going forward and improve on that front. And I think just like PSPS, we've taken a lot of lessons learned. We're working through a lot of difficult challenges, and we just have to get better and faster at it and bring the resources to bear to get that work done.
Well, I'll just observe that, Mr. Chairman, if we're sitting here expressing concern about a timeline that I think was described as 12 or 13 years, clearly more than a decade, that means that based on the system hardening experience that PG&E is sharing with us for 2019, you'd need to see a 300 to 400% increase in the amount of work you did on an annual basis just to make the 10 to 12 to 13 years. And you'll forgive me if I express some skepticism about that, but it sounds to me like 10 to 12 to 13 years would be a very best case scenario. Again, thank you for your patience. Back to you, and I do have some additional comments and questions. Yeah, but I also want to make sure we get through the presentation, so thank you.
I think we're getting there. There's no doubt there's a lot of work in front of us, and we have to take what we've done last year and are planning to do this year, continue to get better and faster and more effective at it. Okay. This is similar data for the late October, early November events. You can see that we were forecasting 55 mile per hour plus winds in generally the same footprint, again along the east foothills and then west of the valley there and along the Santa Cruz Mountains. This is the actual wind speeds that we experienced. So the gap was was not quite as big on this event, 47 miles per hour, which again would exceed the gust thresholds that we have in our PSPS criteria. Slide 9 here shows the extent of the hazards and the damage that we found over the course of both events. The blue triangles are the first early October event. The green is the late October, November event. And you can see there was general consistency in terms of number of hazards and damages across both events and locations. And again, I described earlier what a damage and a hazard are. The important thing to remember here is this does impact restoration. Final restoration timeliness. We'll only restore power after the weather has passed and when we're certain it's safe to do it. Before we can restore power to customers, our crews must visually inspect for damage to ensure the lines are safe to energize. Those inspections involve vehicle, foot, aerial patrols, and we have to get through every inch of our line before we can safely restore. Here are just some pictures of the various damage we did find in Santa Clara County. The first one is a broken conductor that detached from the secondary line. This is a service drop going into a home or an outbuilding. Similarly, the second picture is just a branch on a service drop, and then the third is debris on electric conductor, any one of which, had those lines been energized, could have caused a spark and a potential ignition. Okay. We get a lot of questions around, it's bright and sunny and I'm not feeling any wind where I live, and yet you're turning off my power. Why is that? So this gets to again, the interconnected nature of the grid and the fact that many of our communities are served with power that originates far from where they live. And you can see here in the picture, this is just a kind of a simple graphic that shows power being transmitted across our transmission lines through our substation and then down to the distribution lines and ultimately to an end-use customer. And where that power is coming from, in this example, has 50-mile-per-hour wind gusts, which would potentially put those assets at risk of creating a spark or an ignition. If those customers are served by those upstream transmission lines or distribution lines without any additional redundancy that allows us to switch around and reroute power, they will be impacted in a PSPS event because we have to shut off the power at the source, so to speak, and where the weather event is happening. This next slide just gets at some of the community resource center details that we had during those two events. We had one during the first event at Avaya Stadium, and then two in the second event. We've gotten a lot of feedback on CRCs. This is one of the areas that we're really targeting to improve in terms of partnering with county agencies, proper siting, making sure that these sites are in or close to where our customers are being impacted. We're looking at extending hours, extending services, but we got quite a bit of feedback on CRCs and ways to improve. And so again, we appreciate the ongoing partnership there. And we did, throughout these events across our system, in October of last year, we more than doubled our CRC capabilities, and we're planning to continue ramping that up, as I mentioned. This last slide, it's word heavy, I apologize, but it speaks to some of the high-level efforts that we're taking to reduce PSPS impacts. So specifically, our focus is on narrowing the scope of future safety shutoffs and minimizing those impacts. Part of the way we do that, really one of the most important ways we do that is identifying the proper scope right up front, which again is directly related to weather forecasts and the level and granularity of the data we have there on upcoming weather predictions. So we are expanding our weather data set by quite a bit, both our historical data set and our daily data set that we get on more of a real-time basis. And then you'll see the third bullet there in the first section is related to enhancing the resolution and the granularity at which we determine the weather impacts. And so this is really going from, as we draw the forecasted weather location and translate that to how it overlays against our own assets and our customers and our communities. This means that we will be able to do that now almost on a parcel level, on a block-to-block level. And so that granularity will allow us to narrow scope as we get into this year's fire season. So setting that upfront scope is critically important for reducing the impact of these PSPS events. And this year we'll have far more data to help us do that. The second piece there is about reducing inspection times to speed up safe power restoration. The big bogey there in terms of restoring power, frankly, is daylight hours and our ability to get resources out into the field and complete as many of those safety inspections during daylight as we can. One of the ways we're going to do that is dramatically increasing our aerial fleet and our ability to perform those aerial patrols and inspections as we look to restore.
Jake, just a quick question. I understand the daylight. I understand not having your people's safety threatened out in high winds and rain and everything else. Did people work to initiate repairs during the weekend?
Yes.
They did.
Absolutely.
Okay, that was one big contention. A whole lot of calls and emails that I took was it was clear, but they were told, people talking to me told me they were told by PG&E, no, we don't work weekends.
Yeah,
and this is when the power was off.
From PSPS specifically?
So yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I understand not working at night because you got people driving drunk, dark, whatever. It's dangerous, even with great big floodlights. It's dangerous. I understand, although I do see highway repairs at night, so I kind of wonder about that. But I understand high wind and high rain being dangerous to your people up on the high wires. I get that. But I just wanted to get confirmation from you here in a public meeting that you did, in areas that were blacked out, you did in fact have people, when it wasn't dangerous, out there working on Saturday and Sunday.
We had people inspecting and repairing every single day during all of our active PSPS events right up until those daylight hours expired and it became unsafe to continue that work.
Thank you.
To add a little clarity, in the slide with regard to the 12 daylight hours, that's really referencing the aerial inspection process.
Gotcha.
So there are still inspection processes that can occur if it's safe to do so via ground and foot. And so that provides a little bit more context. We just need to ground our helicopter fleet at the end of daylight. And, you know, when you're talking October, that really translates into 12 hours of opportunity to get the ships in the air and to start patrolling the assets. Now, there are things that we do to segment the system and put it in a posture that's favorable to be restored quickly, so when the daylight does come, we hit the ground running and we're quite efficient at that. In addition, I just wanted to add to Jake's point on the aerial resources. So we had 35 exclusive use helicopter contracts last year that we locked in the pilots and the ships for this purpose, and it paid dividends for us. We're expanding that to 65 for 2020. And in addition to that, we're also commissioning 2 fixed-wing aircraft that we're going to equip with high-resolution cameras and some infrared technology that will allow us to see some of our transmission assets at night. So that allows us to move the ball, if you will, at night on certain assets that aren't in heavily, vegetation-related areas. And we're of the belief that doing those patrols at night will free up more helicopter assets to put on the distribution system in the daylight hours. So that's how we intend to cut our restoration time nearly in half.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yep.
And that is the main takeaway that I'm hoping people walk away with, is that our aim this year is to reduce that restoration time from 24 to 12 daylight hours. And then finally on this page, those sectionalizing devices that I mentioned previously, we're installing an additional 200 plus sectionalizing devices that effectively allow us to limit the geographical scope of these PSPS events and allow us to shut off the power closer to only the tier 2 and tier 3 areas, and avoid those situations where we have lines traversing through tier 2 and tier 3 areas and taking out those in addition to tier 1 areas. So those sectionalizing devices, again, will allow us to get more granular in our scope.
So Jake, when I talk about reducing the size of grids, is that what you're talking about here, or is this sectionalizing devices something different?
Two different things. So what I talked about earlier was weather data granularity and getting to a more detailed level where we will be able to tell, the weather impact is hitting on the 700 block of Main Street, but maybe not the 1100 block of Main Street. Whereas last year, just the level of data that we had available to us didn't allow us to have insight into that difference. So that's the weather granularity and the enhanced data set we have there. These sectionalizing devices are improvements to our grid that will actually allow us to switch power differently and not have people in tier 1 areas impacted to the extent that they were previously, as an example.
Thank you. Are you finished on your presentation?
I believe so.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Smidian.
Thank you.
Your microphone.
Thank you. Couple of introductory remarks, and then I want to try and see if we can focus on some deliverables as a result of today's meeting. Gentlemen, let me just begin by giving a little background on my perspective. And I don't know how much of this you may or may not be familiar with, but in terms of my take on these issues, it is born out of my experience as a member of the Palo Alto City Council back in the 1990s, where we had responsibility, obviously, for municipal utility, so 5 years there. Then following 4 years on this Board of Supervisors, I went off to Sacramento, where I spent 4 years on the Assembly Utilities and Commerce Committee. I arrived in 2000, just in time for the energy crisis of 2000, 2001. Then I spent 8 years on the Energy Committee in the California State Senate, dealing with many of these same issues, and where I also was the author of the 20% renewable portfolio standard legislation for 2010, and then 33% by 2020. I then came back to this Board of Supervisors, where I was among those who pushed for us to become founding participants in the Community Choice Energy Initiative here in Santa Clara County, and served on that board as one of the founding board members with Silicon Valley Clean Energy. So while I would not hold myself out as someone with expertise on many of the issues that you brought before us, because they're very technical and complicated, I have some history on these issues. I also have some history working with PG&E, so I want to be very clear about my take on that and how it frames my reaction to the information you provide today. First thing I want to say is I want to be very clear about this. Over now literally almost 30 years, I've worked with some very good people at PG&E. So anything I say is not personal. I've had the pleasure to work with people who were smart and dedicated, many of whom, you know, at the line level put themselves at risk to get the job done. That being said, I have long since given up, as I indicated to one of your colleagues, thinking that I can work with the corporate institution that is PG&E in good faith. And I just need to tell you that, so that when you're asking yourself, where's this guy coming from, what's prompting these questions, it is born out of literally 30 years of experience that tells me that PG&E will not put the public interest first. It doesn't give me any pleasure to say that. I'm not here to whack you around. You know, we're not holding press conferences. I just need you to understand that until and unless I see a result, I have no confidence whatsoever that that result is real, that it's going to happen, that it's going to be delivered. So you just sort of need to understand that, regrettably, PG&E, in my experience, has earned that lack of confidence, and that's where we have to go. Now, when we had the initial conversation about scheduling today's hearing, I was of mixed views, because I thought it was important that we have the hearing. But candidly, my experience has been that well-spoken representatives like yourselves get tossed into the mix. You endure an hour or two of sometimes challenging questions, and then you go back to work, and it's another day at the office. And that's not what I want the outcome of this conversation to be. Now, given my lack of confidence in a good faith response in the public interest, I want to be very clear. I think this county can and should have reasonable expectations, and if those reasonable expectations are not met, then I think we need to take whatever steps are necessary to compel them. If we have to do that legally, so I looked at Mr. Mitra, who is sitting here from our county counsel's office, and I see Mr. Rossi and Ms. Pianco, who are also here from the county counsel's office. If that means litigation, then so be it, if that's what it takes to compel performance in the public interest. If it means that we have to comment at the CPUC, which in my view has done a woefully inadequate job of regulating you over the past 25, 30 years, then we will be commenters at the PUC. If it means we have to be advocates for legislation in the state capitol, then we will be advocates for legislation in the state capitol. Because again, my unfortunate experience is that's the only way we can feel any confidence that we're going to get any kind of meaningful response to our entreaties. It gives me, as I said earlier, no pleasure to say that to you. You know, I was raised by a mother who told me that you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. That may come as a surprise to you based on what I've just shared with you. But that's just, you know, after 30 years, I kind of have to be realistic about what my expectations are. So, Mr. Chairman, what I'd like to do is turn to what I think of as some reasonable requests, engage staff expertise to make sure that we can get some clarity about what we need for the next one of these, and make sure that we get some commitments today or in very short order to make sure they're there. Could we start with, I believe it's, let me just make sure I got the right slide number. Slide number 3, please, that shows Santa Clara County. So, I'm looking at that geography. I'm looking at the size of our county. I'm looking at the size of the area that PG&E has identified as Tier 2. I'm looking at the size of the geography PG&E has identified as Tier 3. And then if we could go to the next slide, please. I'm noting that for the first event, we had all of 1 community resource centers available, and that for the second, we had just 2. So let me turn to staff and say, is that an adequate number, given the tens of thousands of folks who are affected and the geography of this county?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that's where the growth opportunity is for us to expand our CRCs. And as indicated in the Lilich file back to Hewlett today, I think one of those growth areas is utilizing existing facilities, more specifically our county libraries are geographically well suited throughout the valley. You don't have a map before you today, but if you were to overlay our county libraries with the impact zones, you would see the adjacency of those areas. I also feel that, as indicated, that Los Gatos Library, while not a county library, I think has great potential to become a CRC. I know there's a great deal of interest from the town of Los Gatos to establish that. In fact, during the PSPS events, they had reached out to the county for assistance, which we did offer to establish a CRC. Thus not needing that, then that went on our list of things to consider for the future. Also, there is a gap.
Excuse the interruption. I just want to sort of cut to the chase on this question. So what do we need from PG&E, and what do we need to do as a county if we think we need more of those locations in those sites? And the good news is that Supervisor Wasserman and I are the 2 representatives to the County Library Board, so we know where each and every one of those libraries is that you just referenced. But what do we need to ask our county staff to do, and what do we need to ask PG&E to do? Because I want to make sure that before these folks walk out the door, we've got them on the record on some things that we need to do better next time.
Okay, let's cut to the chase. What I would like, and I think what the county needs in partnership with PG&E, is we need to assess additional CRCs, what their power needs are and their power requirements are, and then we work in partnership to determine that and to look at retrofitting and upgrading those facilities to more effectively be utilized for CRCs.
And is that our responsibility? Is that their responsibility? Is it a shared responsibility? And if it's a shared responsibility, then who's responsible for which piece?
Shared.
And what do they do and what do we do?
Well, that is rather technical in nature, but I'll take a stab at it. I think what I would look to for PG&E would be the expertise of assessing the buildings for their building requirements, power requirements, existing requirements, how they're powered up. I think our responsibility would be to help ensure that we utilize resources that we may have available to partner with them to get that done in general.
Okay.
So if I could.
Please, through the chair.
We have a CRC team working on exactly that right now. We've been in active conversations, and I completely support what Mr. Reed is saying. We are assessing more sites closer to those Tier 2 and Tier 3 areas. We want to have more sites at our disposal because we know that the weather hits in different ways during different events. We are actively working together to assess things like ADA compliance, the ability of these sites to either already have temporary generator capabilities or have the ability to be retrofitted to accept them and install things like transfer switches. So that is part of our responsibility to get folks out to these sites, vet them appropriately for all the feasibility things that we need to, the criteria that they need to pass. And we are actively working on that.
The timeline for that is what?
We need to have these, ideally we will have the list of sites and the electric system capabilities and that engineering assessment done by, I'm thinking here, end of March.
So, Mr. Reed, that's something we can get a report back on to see whether or not that's been done, whether or not both you and the folks at PG&E have been able to work within that timeline?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that would be helpful in just in terms of making sure that we don't let things slip through the cracks. And then what about staffing for the community resource centers as well? Mr. Reed, what do you think? What do we need? I think part of the challenge, as I heard it from this last experience, was that people were hard-pressed to find somebody that they could talk to who actually knew what was going on. That's not a criticism, that's just a challenge of the system.
Yeah, I'll take that. That's our responsibility. We're looking at a variety of different staffing options to fill those needs. The two main options at the moment are expanding training and expanding the available pool of internal employees who we would call upon to staff those sites. Historically, it's been people in the customer service organization, and to your point, as these events scale up, we just don't have the number of resources in those departments to go staff those events, so we need to call on a larger internal pool of employees to go staff them. We're also looking and exploring more of a contract staffing model as well, where we can still have PG&E people on site because that's important, but augment that with external folks as well.
And the resolution of those considerations and explorations is expected when? Again, I'm looking for dates.
I don't know that I can give you a specific timeline on that or a date, but well before fire season, because we have to get this done before June 1st.
Okay, that's before June 1st is
3 months.
Helpful. So I just want to make sure I understood correctly and don't have expectations that I shouldn't. So does that mean, I'm looking both to our county staff and the PG&E folks, that if, for the sake of discussion, we had half a dozen community resource centers, we'd have somebody in each one of those community resource centers who could answer intelligently and knowledgeably the questions that came from folks in the community?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Reed, you made passing mention, I think, of power generators. Is that what we're talking about here?
Possibly. It could be a combination of things. We may look at solar with battery backup. We might look at emergency generators, and in some cases may look at buildings that could accept emergency generators to come on site during a time of need and to be plugged into the building. So I think it's a variety of options we're exploring.
And who has the responsibility for both the cost and the actual implementation of those power sources?
Well, I don't know that it's, I think both sides in partnership could share that opportunity together, but I don't know that I'm prepared today to say who's directly responsible for the cost of doing all of that work.
PG&E, what do you think?
I would say something similar. I think there's more work to be done on sorting out all of the appropriate funding.
And what's the timeline for sorting that out?
It's got to be done before fire season.
Thank you again. And I'll just say, if you're going to turn off people's power, you got some responsibility for making sure that there's power someplace where they can get the services they need. What else do we think?
If I could,
Please,
just real
through the chair.
quickly, all of our CRCs, that is a basic function of all the CRCs, is that they will all have power. I think the question is how many hard wall facilities, how many new or additional hard wall facilities can we sufficiently retrofit such that they can accept temporary or mobile generation or even have a permanent standby generator installed, which I think is probably a longer term proposition.
Thank you. There are a number of other questions on this particular piece, the CRCs, but I want to move on to the next issue, which is...
Supervisor Simitian, before you do, may I make one comment about the CRCs?
Thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you. I believe we had 3 CRCs last year.
3 between 2 events.
3
different
between
sites.
2 events.
Yep.
And the most recent information I have is that about 60 people used those CRCs. So I appreciate it must be done before fire season, not only finding the funding, not only finding the locations, not only buying the equipment and having a plan, but the public has to know in advance where the CRCs are. You need to know where your candles and flashlights are before your power goes out. You need to know where you're going before you got to go there. So you said June 1st. That's 3 months and a week. So there's a lot of things that have to happen. I appreciate your discussing it. Supervisor Simitian and I sit on this Hewlett committee, which is undertaking this interaction with PG&E and this whole PSPC issue. I also chair, and that Dana runs so well, what we call the EOAC, the Emergency Operational Area Council. And as Supervisor Simitian brought up, he and I also represent the county on the Santa Clara County Library District. The libraries, Dana, that you brought up, I think are a wonderful idea. And I know that the library board and committee are behind offering those as places for emergency uses, in this case, in the event of a power shutoff. So while you're putting together this plan and this timeline, and we'd like to have you back to Hewlett sooner than later and share that with us, is the availability. And if you need the connections there, I chair the library district. Contact my office. We'll put you in touch with the library people. So you'll have addresses, you'll have their facilities people, you'll have an understanding of what they do have, don't have, portable units, whatever it might be, whatever we need to do, generators. We need to be able to tell people in advance where they can go. And when they go there, they've got to be able to have power on to do that. And we're looking at all that in 3 months and a week. And I have not seen a drier winter than what we've been experiencing the last 6 weeks. I haven't seen it. I was really happy in the fall. We're having a big wet fall. I thought this is great. But now that this winter, or lack of this winter, really concerns me with the fire season that's coming up. We have the experience now of what a PSPC event is, what your parameters are, your wind gusts, your humidity levels, things like that. I'm very encouraged by a number of things you said, and I'm very skeptical about a number of things you said happening. You brought up, I believe, trimming 1 million trees. Was it trimming or removing? Trimming?
Trimming and or removing. It
Trimming
just
1
depends
million
on the
trees.
condition of the tree and the
You
location.
trim 1 million trees. I know when I trim the trees in my backyard, next year I got to trim them again. So that's temporary. That's a here, take 2 Advil, see me in the morning. A fix, for instance, is undergrounding, getting away from falling branches, wind gusts, things being blown onto your transmission wires. Undergrounding. And I know the cost to underground is zillions, okay, per block, per square mile. I understand that. But I need to hear that PG&E thinking ahead, and that's beyond this 10-year program, which may be a 20-year program, which may be a 30-year program, is fixing the problem. You don't want to prune 1,000,000 trees and every couple of years prune them again and then have branches come when wind gusts hit 40 miles an hour or things are blown into them. You don't want, if that's a high risk fire area, you either want to have wires that no matter what goes on them, doesn't ignite, or you want them underground. You got to solve the problem. Please continue, Supervisor.
Thank you. Well, your comments lead very nicely into my next set of questions and concerns, which is around the issue of communication. And I'm aware that there is a notification process for public safety power shutoffs, and I'm wondering what the opt-in rate in Santa Clara County is for folks who are in your service area. How many of them have you been able to engage in that noticing process?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So just a little bit of context setting here, our foundation setting. Our customer notification process engages or is done through multiple channels, primarily through phone, text, and email. Customers do not have to opt in to that notification. They will all get notified as long as we have their contact information on file. The numbers for Santa Clara County are right around 99%. So there's just over 600,000 customers that we serve in Santa Clara County. All but roughly 1% have at least one of those communication channels on file with us.
And Jake, excuse me, I'm going to take the chair's privilege here and just interject one moment.
If I could ask you to wait until I get an answer to my question, Mr.
Go ahead.
Chairman. There is, however, an opt-in system, yes?
That is a different notification system, which is really at the zip code level. That's primarily geared towards non-PG&E account holders who want a broader notification of a PSPS event happening in a zip code. It's really aimed for, caregivers, parents of children who might go to a school at a different, in a different area. That's a slightly different notification that you do have to opt in for.
And those would be the very people, of course, who would be most adversely affected by a power shutoff. And so my question, again, which remains unanswered, is what percentage of the folks have opted in?
I don't have that at my fingertips, but that's something that we can readily provide.
Okay.
And I'll ask our local team we can track that down and get that to you shortly.
What I'd like to ask, and I'm looking to staff to make sure that we follow up on this, is that we not only get the number, but that we get a plan from the folks at PG&E for boosting that number, unless it's at some extraordinarily high level. Because if we've got the folks, as I say, who are most in need of a notification, who are not taking advantage of an opt-in system just because they don't know or they haven't gotten to it, or you've asked them 3 times and they still haven't taken advantage of it, if this is going to be part of their future, I'd like to make sure that we've given everybody every possible encouragement and made it as easy as possible for them to opt in. And the next question I have, and County Counsel's office has shared with me some concern about the need for a geographic information system, a GIS map of all of our cell towers that do not have battery or generator backup, and overlaying that with what I am told in GIS parlance are the polygons that depict the impacted areas. Mr. Reed, are you familiar with this concern and the need for this?
I am.
Could you share with us why it's important, and then could PG&E tell us what it will take to get the information that we need?
Because we rely on those multiple cell towers that are held by private carriers to utilize our alerting and warning system, and more specifically, it's a chief component of the WIA system, which would reach out to cell phone customers, if you will, to provide vital and in timely information.
Have we asked PG&E for this information previously?
I have not.
County Counsel?
I don't believe we have.
Okay. Can we ask for it today?
Well, it sounds like we just did.
Okay. PG&E?
So this is a tricky one. We are in the process right now of scrubbing through all of the critical facilities throughout the system as under the new terms and definitions that the CPUC has set forth. We do plan in events to readily share all of that critical facility data, the locations, medical baseline information. Where we are running into some challenges right now in terms of sharing specifically telecom sites in advance is that there are some competitive issues there, and there is significant resistance to sharing in advance those telecom sites. We are committed to do it, and the CPUC has given us direction that we will be doing it in event, but there's more to work through sorting out the legalities of sharing critical facilities, specifically telecom sites, in advance of an event.
Thank you. I understand your answer. I find it wholly unsatisfactory. That's not a critique of you or your answer. It's just I heard what you said, and the answer is unsatisfactory. Getting the information in the moment of crisis is not the way to be prepared for events that you have warned us are going to be coming and will be repeated over the course of the next several years. We need the information in advance. If there are matters of trade secrets, confidential information, proprietary concerns, they can be resolved through careful drafting, I'm sure. But let me just say, I don't think you want to be sitting here explaining after the next fire why somebody couldn't get the help they needed because we were still arguing about who had access to whose cell phone tower information. And more to the point, we don't want to see that tragedy. And I know you don't either.
You're certainly correct. We don't.
So I'm going to ask County Counsel and Mr. Reed to follow up on that issue because I don't see how anyone could justify allowing a tragedy to happen when we knew that we were going to be without access to that information, had failures that were anticipated, and couldn't respond to the failures that we anticipated simply because we didn't have the information until we already knew, frankly, that we had a problem on our hands. So I'm going to wrap it up there, Mr. Chairman, today. I'm going to go back through my 1, 2, 3 on this one, because you know I always have 3 things.
I had a question back on.
And I'm wanting to see from PG&E and from our county staff and the county counsel's office some definitive follow-up on the community resource centers, both in terms of location and personnel, as well as resources there. The community notification, I am not yet persuaded that every step has been taken to make sure that people know what's happening. And this issue of situational awareness, which can apparently only be addressed by sharing GIS information overlaid with data about the public safety power shutoff impacted areas. Those are the 3 that I am laying down today and that I hope we'll get something tangible on sooner rather than later.
Thank you. And I know staff's writing those down, and I know PG&E representatives. And Jake, if I called you Zach earlier, I apologize. I'd written down Jake Z.
You didn't.
And I think I thought. Anyway, I do want to throw you one softball, and then I think we're going to wrap up on this, unless there's anybody else with comments. Occasionally, you mentioned, as you did just a few minutes ago, 600,000 customers. The general public, when they hear 600,000 customers, thinks it's 600,000 people. And what you mean are 600,000 addresses which you provide power to. And if each address happens to have an average of 3 people, 600,000 is 1.8 million. So I would just ask, if you say 600,000 customers, if you could say accounts, or if you could say 600,000 customers represented approximately 1.8 million people, or whatever you want to say. But I noticed during the PSPS instances, different information came out where power was going to be restored to 1,200 customers. And that was 3,500 people. Or it was to 3,500 people and they had seen 3,500 customers at one time and 3,500 people the other time. And it was confusing. If you can either be consistent or be more specific when you use that particular description, it's your life. You guys understand all these acronyms, and we got a whole bunch of acronyms you never even want to have anything to do with, okay? But in that particular instance, I can tell you as a representative of the public, it's confusing, that back and forth. So next time, if you see accounts or residences, just please use one or clarify it. Any other questions, Supervisor Simonian?
Not today, thank you.
Okay, committee members, any other questions of PG&E? And we had no additional speaker cards. Thank you very much for your time.
Appreciate the opportunity.
You betcha. Oh, and thank you for my big asterisk here was the microgrids. I thought about my house where I've got my main on the outside and I've got 3 sub-panels inside. And if I need to do some work in the laundry room, I cut off the power to that, but my kitchen still works. And again, it comes back to your tier 1, 2, tier level, whatever you call them, 1, 2, and 3 situations. If an area over here's got the wind and the humidity and stuff going on, and an area over here doesn't, please refine your system so you shut this off and you don't shut this off.
And before folks step away, and excuse the interruption, Mr. Chairman, did I understand correctly that we're going to bring this back at the March meeting?
Yes, I would like to bring this back to the March meeting. Will you be prepared to answer or respond to the questions that were raised?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move on to item number 5. You had a few
Really,
questions or
very
comments
quickly,
to make
I
on 5.
appreciate the staff presence. I think the folks from PG&E are wondering if we're really done with their item, and I think the answer is for today we are.
Yes.
Thank you.
We understand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Dan, thank you.
County staff as well. Mr. Reed.
Mr. Lee, come on down.
And as Mr. Lee may have known, this was almost a consent calendar item, but for one question, and I can't imagine it's going to come as a surprise, which is in order for us to stay on track, that means we need another $10 million infusion in the coming budget year. Is that the understanding and expectation in your office, the budget office, the county executive's office, somebody's office?
Yes, we're currently working with the county exec's office and OBA to sort of come up with recommendations on how to make the next installment.
And that's a function of where does the money come from? I know last year we had a specific source, and you're trying to identify the source this year.
Right. Last year, we had sort of 2 sources, the one-time funds and then the home funds. So this year is a little more challenging, but we're looking at options.
All right. Well, again, we made I think a $40 million commitment to the community. I think we all understand that in some instances circumstances change, but my expectation is that we will continue to make good on that commitment, and I appreciate your efforts, particularly in making sure that that happens. So thank you for that. Moving to a different part of the report, I just wanted to make sure I understood, because as you know, the Wilton Court is in my district, and I hear from folks about that project. Did I understand correctly from the enclosure that whatever shortfall in funding they had has now been addressed, and they have found other funds and their project funding is complete, or did I read that too optimistically?
That is correct. I believe that the city of Palo Alto was able to increase its funding allocation, and Palo Alto Housing Corporation has submitted a application for low-income housing tax credits.
Oh,
great.
nice.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was all I had, and I'm happy to
Consider received.
move the receipt. And thank you.
Got it. 6 was continued. We now move on to 7, which is to receive report from the Office of County Exec, SEPA. Welcome. relating to proposed local regulations of hemp cultivation for unincorporated Santa Clara County. And Joe, they're presenting. You got okay. A nice bold page number. I like it.
Unfortunately, that's not our presentation for item 7.
Oh, well, we'll see how yours measures up now.
Yes, I'm worried. While we're sorting that out, Kyle Larson, I'm an analyst in the Office of the County Executive. For discussion on this item this morning, I'm joined by Joe Devaney, County Agricultural Commissioner, and Manira Sandier, Principal Planner in the Department of Planning, who I anticipate is coming down right now to the board chambers.
There's Manera.
So we'll just get started, and hopefully we can pull up the presentation midway through. By way of background for today's discussion, it's important to establish what hemp is. Hemp is defined by state and federal law as the plant cannabis sativa having no more than 0.3% tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, on a dry weight basis. THC is the primary psychoactive component in marijuana. For comparison, psychoactive cannabis averages about 10% THC, but can exceed 30% by dry weight. For a timeline of changes to federal and state law concerning hemp, we begin with the 2014 Farm Bill, which legalized the limited cultivation of hemp for research purposes under state pilot programs. In September of 2018, California Senate Bill 1409 updated state law to be consistent with the requirements of the 2014 Farm Bill. The 2018 Federal Farm Bill removed hemp as a Schedule I controlled substance and provided states with regulatory authority over the production of hemp once a state's plan had been approved by the USDA. Late last year, in October, California Senate Bill 153 required California Secretary of Food and Agriculture to submit to the USDA a hemp production plan no later than May 1st of this year.
And Kyle, if you can hold just a minute. Peggy, are we working on getting this up on the screen? Or is somebody coming down to help maybe? You're it. All right, thank you.
Yeah, and finally, late last year, the USDA interim final rule was published, which established rules for hemp cultivation under the 2018 Farm Bill and for the USDA's approval of state hemp plans. Thank you, Peggy. Which brings us to today's item. As outlined in the report, staff anticipates that California's state hemp plan will be approved by the USDA no later than July of this year. And absent the adoption of local regulations by the county, registered growers in the unincorporated areas of the county would be able to cultivate hemp by right consistent with the county's existing regulations related to producing agricultural commodities. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, excuse the interruption. But there's one area here where I really am just confused about the timeline, and I need a little help. The thing that is driving the staff's proposal is the anticipation of rules from whom by when again, please? Would you say that one more time?
Yes. So the California Department of Food and Agriculture will be preparing and submitting a state hemp production plan to the USDA.
And the date on that again is?
Yeah, by state law, the requirement is that the plan is submitted no later than May 1 of this year.
Now, sometimes things don't happen according to schedule. So what I'm trying to understand is whether or not I really think it makes sense. And I genuinely don't know because I'm trying to keep the moving parts straight. So if they submit their plan, the state submits a plan to the feds, yes?
Yes, sir.
And that's supposed to happen by May the 1st. And what happens then that's part of all this sense of urgency that we're dealing with here?
Sure. The USDA will have then up to 60 days to review the plan that's submitted. And then if approved, the county would begin to receive registration applications from interested growers for cultivation of hemp in the unincorporated areas of the county.
And if we hadn't taken action by that time, do I understand that they're entitled then to grow by right, essentially? Is that what the point of the staff memo was?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'm going to paraphrase. I think what the staff memo was trying to communicate was, and I don't mean that critically, I struggled with the different moving pieces, as I said. Hey, board, if you don't take some action on this, then it's possible that within 60 days after May the 1st, a bunch of folks are going to show up on our doorstep and they're going to be able to do this whether we like it or not, and they're going to be able to do it without any of the restrictions that we might otherwise put in place. Did I get that part right?
Precisely.
All right. But now what happens? But we really don't know if the state's going to do anything by May the 1st. We just know that they're supposed to.
By state law, they're required to submit a plan to the USDA by May 1st.
But they haven't done it yet.
No.
Okay. But it's not May 1st yet. That's right. Fair enough. Okay. But here's what I know from 12 years of working at the state. Sometimes they comply, sometimes they don't. And then the federal government is supposed to take action within 60 days. But until they take action, we're not at risk of having anybody show up, right? I mean, they can't. Let's say the federal government sat on its hands for 90 days and didn't issue anything. During that period of time, nobody can come and say 60 days has passed since the state has put its paperwork in.
That's correct. Until a state plan is approved by the USDA for California, the county agricultural commissioner would not accept registrations or approve them for our cultivation.
One point there is, if we don't have a plan, then the federal interim rule will be in effect, and we'll have to go by that, which does allow it.
Which explains why I've been confused. And so does that mean we live with the federal interim plan even if the state paperwork, if the dog ate their homework, if it disappears, if there is no state submission?
That is correct.
And when would that happen? Because it can't happen within 60 days after an event that doesn't happen. So would it happen within 60 if there's no submittal on May the 1st?
It could happen, yes, right May 1st. We'd have to go by the federal rules, is my understanding.
I'd like more clarity on that, Mr. Chairman, so I'm looking both to the planning department and to your department, to SEPA and to county council as we go forward. I really do think we need to know under what circumstances and on what timeline do we get jammed by the fact that the feds are going to authorize this regardless of whatever action we do or don't take. Because now I've got state action which may or may not happen, federal action which may or may not happen, and federal action which may apply if the other things don't happen. And that's a little hard to keep track of. Okay, thank you. I apologize for that.
Thank you. I just want to ask a little clarification before you continue on your slides here. Your intent is being proactive so that we have something in place when and if the state does their thing, when and if the federal government does their thing. We have something local control, if you will. That is your intent of bringing this forward to us at this time.
That is correct.
To move it forward through and ultimately to the Planning Commission and to get it done, because our process takes a while too. Okay, thank you.
Well, as long as we're still on timeline and process, Mr. Chairman, you got a pretty aggressive timeline here, and I worry that it may not have enough opportunity for community outreach. And given some of the potential risks that you've identified in the memo, and thank you for that. If we move along expeditiously and are proud of ourselves for having done that, only to discover that there are some unhappy results and that folks feel like they never got the word, nobody told them, which we often do here no matter what best efforts we provide, that would be an unfortunate outcome.
Regrettable, absolutely.
And disappointing as well, Mr. Chairman. So that's part of what my thinking is in asking these questions. Thank you again.
Thank you. Please continue.
So the next slide identifies the regulations adopted in neighboring jurisdictions, and approaches have varied, including adopting temporary moratoriums on the cultivation of hemp, establishing setbacks from sensitive receptors, placing limits on total cultivated acreage, and restricting cultivation to indoor operations. Next, Joe will discuss some of the possible benefits and concerns associated with cultivation of hemp in Santa Clara County.
Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, botanically speaking, this is a very interesting plant. It is a multitude of uses. It can be a good rotation crop. Our soils here are kind of clay-like. It would do well here. There's very few pests that it has, so a lot of the hemp growers actually grow it organically. It actually remediates soil if there's heavy metals in the soil. It can be everything from fibers for clothes, fibers for paper. It does a good job in cleaning CO2 out of the air. It can be for clothes, hemp seeds, hemp milk. There's even hemp beer. It's a lot of things. 10,000 uses is what it's claimed to do. But far and away, the most interesting one that most people want to grow for now is CBD oil, which is an oil that's extracted out of the buds of the flower. And it has lots of suggested uses from food products, supplements, and also into pharmaceuticals, none of which the FDA has approved at this date. So if we can move to the next slide. It is an ag commodity. We can't deny that now. So yeah, there is a thought that let it be an ag commodity. All ag commodities have smells and issues and field workers and all kinds of things that go along with it, slow tractors. This one does have a few special concerns that I think are important to note. It does smell like the cannabis plant, which to some people is very offensive. As it goes further in its growth period, it smells stronger. There are some varieties that smell at great distances and some that don't smell that much. The genetic variability in this plant is tremendous. Just noting the fact that it can be 0 THC basically all the way to 30% is some of the stuff people like to recreationally use. They haven't really established stable genetics in the seeds or in the plants. So there's a public perception out there that it might be cannabis because it's really a hard plant to nail down. There's also an element of crime that people bring up a lot. I did do a lot of research on this, and there has been no evidence of violent crimes associated with hemp at all. There has been some thefts out of the field, just like happens with cherries or with anything else. That can probably be expected that some people will try to steal it. And then if it is more than 0.3, it is cannabis, so there has to be some regulations in place or some plan in place to be able to destroy that plant. To grow hemp, it's much cheaper, and there's not as much licensing as it is to grow cannabis. So there's some thought that people will try to grow cannabis under the guise of hemp. But I think the way the state has their regulations, it should be okay. If we could have the next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about our proposed plan here for Santa Clara County. One more slide. We were proposing a two-pronged approach. The first part involves the registration with my office, and this is based on state regulations that are in place now. It's there's not any limits. It's just a registration process that I'll go through in a minute. The local component that we're proposing today involves a hemp cultivation clearance plan from Planning Department. So Manir will talk about that in a minute. So what will happen is somebody will come to my office. The state requires a $900 fee. They have to. It's not a very difficult process. It's just GPS to really identify where it's going to be grown. They do have to use approved seed cultivars. As I mentioned, there's lots of testing and seed breeding and variability. There are a few varieties that are known to be hemp and very low THC. So from the gate, you have to use one of those that have been identified. My office will be doing some inspection to make sure you're meeting the rules. And then we'll be doing some sampling 15 days before harvest. And then the sampling is the only way to really tell what this is. And that's when we'll find out what the THC level is. And if it's below 0.3, it'll be able to be moved and whatever they want to use with it. But if it's above 3, then we'll have to figure out a destruction plan. And there's rules in the current state regulations about a destruction plan needs to be submitted. I'll have to approve it. Most of the time it's just chopping and disking and working into the soil. But this will have to be overseen to make sure this cannabis plant doesn't disappear. And the sheriff's office, we've worked with them and have a plan to do so. So now I'm going to hand it over to Manira to handle the hemp cultivation clearance.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning, respected supervisors. Manira Sandhir, Principal Planner with the County Planning Department. As Joe mentioned, we are considering a two-pronged approach to hemp cultivation in Santa Clara County. Our focus is on reducing and minimizing some of the concerns that we've observed with hemp cultivation, given its similarities to the cannabis plant. Primarily, we're looking at restricting hemp cultivation to the exclusive agriculture zoning district and not allowing it in the resource conservation areas such as hillsides, rural residential, or the ag ranchland areas. We anticipate that this will promote hemp grows in this exclusive ag areas. And, as you're aware, the Valley Agricultural Plan promotes a diversity of uses in that area. We do want to streamline the process, however, for such hemp cultivation uses, and therefore we propose establishing a clearance process, which is not a discretionary review process such as a conditional use permit or a special permit. We propose establishing special standards for this hemp cultivation, including a quarter-mile to potentially a half-mile buffer from any sensitive receptors, which includes religious institutions, daycares, schools, and properties with a residential zoning designation, as well as a 200-feet buffer from a property boundary line. Next slide, please. This map shows some of the analysis that the planning staff in coordination with the Ag Commissioner's Office has conducted to see which parcels would be eligible for hemp cultivation. As you can see on the slide, the green shows the areas that are the exclusive ag areas that do not overlap or that are outside the quarter-mile buffer that the county staff is proposing. Most of these areas would be focused in southern Santa Clara County, some of them in Coyote Valley, around the city of Morgan Hill and San Martin, and then also in the ag preserve areas east and south of Gilroy.
Excuse the interruption.
Yes.
Serious question. Are any of these areas in District 5, my supervisorial district?
No.
So none of this cultivation would be allowed in District 5. Is that correct?
That is correct if this ordinance moves forward as currently proposed.
Thank you.
Because of the ag zoning.
The proposed approach would result in approximately 1,800 parcels being eligible for hemp cultivation, with over 16,000 square feet being available. Next slide, please. Staff is also proposing additional provisions and requirements associated with the hemp cultivation clearance process. Specifically, we would require that a grower must be the property owner or provide written consent from the deed holder for that property, and also limiting registered growers and our property owners to a cumulative total of 50 acres of hemp cultivation in these areas. And that is primarily to address concerns about hemp being a very new ag commodity which the staff hasn't really fully evaluated the impacts that could result from hemp, as well as to maintain a diversity of ag commodities that are grown in Santa Clara County. Next slide, please. Additional provisions would require that the county would be authorized to inspect or sample any of these hemp cultivation sites during normal business hours. Signage is something that we've observed other counties have required, and we believe that's a good measure to encourage safety and prevent some of the theft concerns that Joe identified. And then in addition, we recommend that the Ag Department would do an on-site inspection once the hemp clearance has been issued and hemp is being grown on-site. Next slide.
And finally, the last slide represents proposed next steps and timeline, which would reflect a Department of Planning and County Ag staff conducting community outreach meetings in March. Both in Morgan Hill and Gilroy, San Martin, to meet or inform residents and stakeholders of the proposed regulations and to receive input. Staff would then finalize an ordinance and present the proposed hemp regulations to the Planning Commission in March or April for recommendation. And final regulations would go to the Board of Supervisors in April or May for approval. This timeline would align the adoption of the county's regulations with the USDA's anticipated approval of the California State Plan and accommodate for cultivation of hemp in this year. And with that, we're available to take any additional questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Kyle. Anyone here? Doug, I think you're it from the public. Do you wish to speak on this item? Nope. Thank you. Supervisor Simidian.
Thank you. Slide 4 indicates that some other counties have done moratoriums on cultivation. Could you tell me what motivated them to do moratoriums, which is obviously a very different approach than is being suggested here, and why staff has a different take on the issue, presumably?
Most took the moratorium approach because people were wanting to grow it, and that was the best definitive way to say, no, we're not going to let it happen until the federal regulations are in place and the state plan has been approved.
And so is it your view that since we're just about at that moment in time when we're going to be obliged to do this, that a moratorium doesn't make sense? Are we allowed to do a moratorium even if the state and feds act as you indicate they're scheduled to do?
I would like to mention that the federal government has moved very fast on this, remarkably so in my history, because there was so much interest and a lot was coming from out of the country.
Excuse the interruption, Mr. Devaney. I asked, are we allowed to do a moratorium even if they take the action?
I believe we are, and we have Elizabeth Pianca here who might could clarify that.
Lead Deputy County Counsel Elizabeth Pianca, it is my understanding that if hemp is authorized for cultivation under federal law, that we would be able to approve a moratorium that would basically temporarily ban the cultivation if we were able to find, make sufficient findings for the ban because of risks to public health, safety, and welfare.
Which is what we did on cannabis, if I remember correctly, or no? Am I misremembering that?
That is correct.
Thank you. Then I noticed that it indicates that some other counties have limited cultivation to established greenhouses. Could you share with us what the thinking was there and why that wasn't an approach that you're recommending, given the concerns that are recommended in, I believe it is slide 6?
I believe Monterey County established this regulation, and primarily it was because of odor concerns associated with hemp cultivation.
If I may, through the chair, in Monterey County, what we did is we have been impacted, our flower growers have been impacted in the county due to NAFTA. So we had a lot of greenhouses that had fallen to dilapidation. We were trying to find a way to not have a competing interests with our food source and utilize a resource that we had available. And that is why we went to, when I was there at the time, that is why we went into the greenhouses that were available. We had a large number of greenhouses out on Spence Road in some areas there. And so also understanding the location of where Monterey County is, we had some security concerns with the confusion of cannabis itself. And so we wanted to make sure that we were utilizing a resource that was available, among other reasons. Those were not the only reasons.
Thank you. Further to staff, and I'm looking at page 3 of 8 in the staff report, packet page 274. There was reference to a quarter mile from any sensitive receptor. And that is identified, doesn't say if it's an exclusive list or not, but it mentions religious institutions, child daycare, schools, property with a residential zoning designation. Quarter of a mile, if I'm remembering my grade school math, is about 1,320 feet. Am I remembering that right?
Precisely.
Thank you. Given the strength of the odor and the controversy / litigation it's created in other venues, I'm wondering if a quarter of a mile is a sufficient distance. And I heard reference to a half mile. Could you tease out your thinking there a little bit? And I'm wondering whether it's a quarter mile or half mile, but particularly if it's a quarter mile, and Supervisor Wasserman, obviously this is largely in your district and an area you know much better than I, but I'm thinking, for example, does that mean that we'll be just 1,000 feet away from a winery where people are coming on the wine trail to sip a glass of wine while they enjoy the odoriferous skunk-like quality of hemp from just a few feet away, relatively few feet away? What about property that may not be zoned for residential, but it's ag property where at least a unit or two may exist in close proximity? I don't know if there are other commercial ventures that are cheek by jowl. If we look, so I mean, are the outlets something we're all familiar with as we drive down the highway? Are they in close proximity or anything like them, commercial establishments where there'd be a problem if there was a stench, to put it in plain language? So I've thrown a lot at you. Why don't I sit back and let you share your thinking?
I'd be happy to take a first stab at it, and I'm looking at the team to jump in. The quarter mile was considered one option to provide a buffer from the sensitive receptors, primarily because we also observed some other counties doing that, and given the odor concerns, we thought it would be a good starting point. However, recently we've observed that some of these other counties are retracting their requirements and looking at larger buffers because of the very concerns that you identified, Supervisor Simidian. So we would, as a part of the outreach process and as a part of the ordinance development, we would do additional research to establish whether the quarter mile or the half mile buffer would be more appropriate for our county, which does have a larger area of urban-rural interface than some of the other counties in the state. In addition, this particular buffer requirement was from sensitive receptors, and while I agree that wineries do have assembly uses, they are not defined as a sensitive receptor, and we were not considering including them in that list. However, if the board is interested in expanding that list, we could probably do further analysis and make it a requirement as a part of the ordinance.
Well, yeah, I guess and then forgive me, Mr. Devaney, my threshold question really is whether sensitive receptors are the right criteria to use there for the setback, or whether it ought to be, I mean, I think the one thing we all know in land use is everybody thinks they're a sensitive receptor, and you know, we don't want to be unreasonable in accommodating that perhaps, but you know, if we've got folks who are living, working 1,000 feet away and the odor is overwhelming, I think we're setting ourselves up for problems that we might do well to avoid. Mr. Vinnie, forgive me, I saw you leaning in.
One thing I wanted to insert that's very important is the right to farm. Agriculture has smells, there's no doubt about it. Even if it's Napa cabbage or any of the cole crops, when you harvest them and they're rotting in the field and there's residues, there is odors. So I think we have to be careful not to slip down a slope and just start saying all smells are bad, and then it'll all be gone very quickly. So this is going to be an ag commodity. We can't lose track of that. If we make too big of a buffer, we're going to exclude it that way. But in the agricultural zones, that's why we specifically chose that and not all the others. It's to have smells in the agricultural zone is common. To spread manure, even if you're at the outlets, and it doesn't smell all year round too. It's a period of time that starts and stops. It's an annual plant. It's not like it's going to be a 365-day-a-year smell. So I think that we just have to be careful with the right to farm, which is a derivative of the state right to farm. So if someone pushes us on that, there is a right to have those kind of agricultural-related smells.
I would ask you to temper your advocacy with concern for the rights of adjacent property owners as you think about this matter going forward. I would also ask you to consider whether or not managing these difficult adjacencies isn't going to be the best long-term strategy for protecting agriculture in our county. The staff made mention of the fact that we have substantially greater urban ag interface adjacencies than many other counties where I have dealt with these issues, Mr. DeVinny, including in Napa County, by the way. And one of the things I've come to conclude is that the way you make ag strong is by putting policies in place that avoid or limit the potential for tension and friction rather than pretending that it won't exist. So I just want to make sure that we help our friends in ag by not setting them up for being the bad guys if there's a more thoughtful way to do it. Okay?
Point taken. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Again, no speaker cards. I do have some comments. It's pluses and minuses, of course. It's something new. Okay, so there'll be people going, oh my God, what's going on? And Joe, I really appreciate your bringing up the right to farm. Manera, you're bringing up this is being considered to be allowed in ag-zoned areas. Okay. I know some of the issues I've gone through over the years with mushroom farms. Okay, as far as various smells. I have to confess I don't know what hemp smells like when it's rotting in the fields or being cultivated or whatever, but clearly I need to find out. I do want to say I appreciate administration for being proactive and bringing this report to Hewlett. I understand that the new state and federal laws making it legal to cultivate. I certainly had an education of myself about a year ago when we were talking about an individual looking to process hemp in Santa Clara County, and that was not to grow and cultivate hemp, but it's coming this way. I also appreciate the clarification, Joe, when Supervisor Simidian brought up the moratoriums on cultivation and your impression, and perhaps there are outright moratoriums, but that people took a moratorium approach until the state and federal brought their issues, their legislation down the road. I do like the fact about us being proactive. I do like the fact of the community meetings. I do like the fact about making cultivation of industrial hemp, I have to use the right terms, industrial hemp allowed in Santa Clara County. I do understand the difference between it being an ag product versus, I'll say, marijuana based on the THC level, something that needs to be regulated. I also understand the issues the farmers are having growing crops in order to make a living. and survive. And so for me, part of this comes under being ag friendly, but to Supervisor Smidian's point, I want to do so in a responsible way. I can see a lot of farmers that we currently have deciding to put some hemp in there, even if it's between seasons, Joe, as you said, cleaning up the soil, and used a particular term you're familiar with, but where they rotate crops, bringing different nutrients, taking different nutrients out. That also makes the regular crop, if you will, do better. So I understand all those things. I am sensitive, though, to the area about the smell, and I've got a couple of comments here. On the one hand, Supervisor, it's my understanding that hemp only becomes profitable for farmers by planting at least 50 acres. The research and stuff that we've done, and I welcome your coming back to us with contrasting research, but from what I've heard so far, again, from advocates of cultivating hemp, is, and we know this with farming, we've talked about the McMansions, where if you've got a little parcel and you put a house in the middle, the tractor can't turn around, you need contiguous land for farming and to make it pay. So my first comment is, Manira, I think it was you that mentioned or brought up the 50-acre limitation. I'm concerned that's too small. And I'd like you to come back with a different number or more justification for the 50. Because if we say 50 or less, and then I hear from the farmers, well, I'd sure like to get out of tomatoes or mushrooms or peppers or whatever and get into this because I can get more dollars per acre from my farmland. But 50 acres doesn't do the trick. I'd like to know that. So that would be number one. Number two, thank you for the map showing the quarter-mile setback from sensitive receptors. And again, it's a quarter-mile from where it is allowed to be grown, which would be the ag-zoned areas. And yes, farmers understand farmers. My brother-in-law, God rest his soul, had no problem with cow and bull manure. Okay? He was around it. He was used to it. It was part of the ambiance of the ranch. Okay? When the city kid came up there and was there for 48 hours, boy, was it overwhelming. So I do have a concern about what it might be next to and the proximity. So I see your quarter mile. I see you also mentioned a half mile. I would like to have a better understanding, and I'll work with Christopher in my office about this. I'd like to have a better understanding of what might be in excess of a quarter, but not quite a half. And I will find out what hemp smells like. Okay, I will do that so that I am more informed about this to see what kind of thing we're talking about. Because I went down to the mushroom farm and I went down to the composting place to get a whiff, to get an appreciation, and I drove a distance away to see at what point it dissipated or became more tolerable to me. We're doing a lead study now at our airports, and it talks about 50 meters out. It's pretty much dissipated. So there are ranges, even though it's not, Joe, grown all year long, even though it's not harvested all year long, even though it's not decomposing all year long, there is a season, but I want to make sure not to adversely or unfairly affect adjacent properties. Speaking of adjacent properties, the 200-foot property line setback, I have a number of constituents that own a farm that's got multiple property lines, multiple parcels within the same farm. Okay? Kialas would be one, multiple parcels, one property owner. The way I read this regarding the 200-foot property line setback, that was if I own this parcel and this parcel and this parcel and they're all adjacent, I don't want to have 200-foot setbacks on each of my parcels. Okay? I want to be able to be contiguous. So if we're talking about property owners, I would say property owners that are different, that are not the same. Well, you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Otherwise, 200 feet there, 200 feet me, and it's still me. I want to fill the 400 with this or Christmas trees or whatever it might be. Okay? one suggestion I would throw out for your consideration to come back with is if the neighboring, so that's an example with the same property owner. If, on the other hand, it's a different property owner, if the neighboring property owner signs an agreement allowing the encroachment, if you will, I guess is the term, of that 200 feet, and that agreement then runs with the land. So you may have another farmer next door, you may have another person who says, hey, I'm fine with that going there, or not, but if they got the right to do that, they sign off and accept that. And my fourth and final point, when hemp is grown indoors, and Jacqueline, I appreciate your experience of the greenhouses that were proliferated all over, and then over the years, for various reasons, they were not used. And we have a lot of greenhouses in South County that are used, and we have a whole lot that are not used in a state of decomposition with the plastic hanging and they're a blight, they're an eyesore. They really are. And to repurpose those sounds wonderful to me. So I would say when hemp is grown indoors, I'd also like it considered that the 200-foot setbacks be cut in half to 100 feet. Because from where the smell is being originated, it's inside a greenhouse, which by definition restricts the amount of airflow that can blow it onto adjacent properties. Indoor hemp cultivation would have 100-foot setbacks from property lines. And at that point, if they're indoor, perhaps if we go to a half mile, it gets cut to a quarter, or if we're at a quarter mile, it goes down to an eighth. Again, because it's indoor growing as compared to outgrowing. And I look forward to more specificity and detail on your proposed outreach program in March. And please, when you're meeting with community groups in March and presenting all these things, please have some sort of questionnaire or some sort of something that enables you to get the feedback on things that Supervisor Simidian may or may not be in favor of, Supervisor Wasserman may or may not be in favor of, your recommendation may or may not have suggested. Let's throw it out there and see what the feedback really is so that we can come up with a responsible plan that allows for an ag product that the federal and state governments are saying we're allowed to grow. I'm in favor of it, again, because of the low THC level, and this is not marijuana, as many times as I may have to explain to people who call up and say, why are you allowing marijuana to be grown? And explain that it's hemp, and that's different. But I also think this is a way to provide our struggling ag constituents an alternative way, which is not mandatory by any means. If they want to change out of peppers or mushrooms and go into hemp with whatever restrictions we end up putting in place, that's their choice. Thank you. Supervisor Simidian.
Thanks. Just a couple other thoughts. One, because I know staff is sometimes trying to read between the lines, and I want to make sure that I'm clear about what is or isn't between the lines. Notwithstanding my many questions, I'm not hostile to the cultivation of hemp. I cast votes in the California State Legislature more than a decade ago to facilitate the cultivation of hemp here in California. And let me just tell you, it wasn't politically au courant at the time. I'll let it go at that. So please don't misconstrue the concerns that I articulate as being some underlying hostility. The second point I would make is I think Supervisor Wasserman may be onto something with respect to the issue of greenhouses that Ms. Anchano mentioned as well. One other possibility, I'm not sure it's a good idea or not, but I want to throw it out there for staff's consideration is if there's a concern, Supervisor Wasserman, about making sure that there is enough cultivation permitted to make it economically viable, and if you've got some underutilized, falling into disrepair greenhouses in the South County that are consistent with the experience Ms. Anchano has, maybe you allow cultivation in the greenhouses at, say, only counting 50% of the space against whatever limit is set. So if you had a 50-acre limit or a 75-acre limit or a 100-acre limit, but your greenhouse use would be counted on a 1/2 to 1 or a 1/4 to 1 basis, then you might provide some incentives for people to use the greenhouses as a way to get more and to maybe make a relatively modest investment if they thought that was the way they could maximize their yield. So I'm making this up in real time, and it may be the worst idea I've had all year. Years early, but
This year's early.
it's
That's
early.
true.
So I'd ask you to think about that. To anyone who hasn't had the chance to just Google hemp smell lawsuits, I would encourage you to do it because it's clear just how contentious this issue can be, has been in other places. And some of what you'll learn is about cannabis plants, which I know are a different entity, but if we're talking about the same kind of smell, I think we're talking about the same kind of potential in the way of aggravation that hopefully we would avoid. So last word is I want to underscore what I've said, what Supervisor Wasserman has said, but third time's a charm, outreach, outreach, outreach. This is one where inevitably there'll be some frictions and I think you want to make sure you can document the outreach that's been done. County Council, a question for you, and I see Ms. Pianca at the table as well, and it's entirely possible that no one knows the answer today, and if so, I just think it would be worth getting a report back. Is there any reason we couldn't make the ordinance effective date contingent on the action at the federal level?
I believe that we could make the ordinance effective at a future date and time, contingent on future actions, and we can look into that further to confirm.
Yeah, if we're, and again, I'm not sure that I would suggest that or propose it, but I think knowing that we had that flexibility, given the fact that we're dealing with uncertainty on 3 different levels, might be useful. Mr. Mitra, excuse me, through the chair, I see you.
We have in the past made ordinances contingent on certain events, so I don't expect there'll be a difference here, and but we can confirm and get back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good enough. That concludes 7. Thank you all very much. 8 was handled on consent. 9 through 15 was handled on consent. We are adjourning to March 19th. Thank you all very much.
So it's like, it's kind of another issue just to reach you.